October 12th, 1984, 14:30 hours, East Berlin, Normannenstraße, 2022, the headquarters of the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit. Hauptmann Klaus Richter sat in a windowless conference room deep in the Stasi complex, staring at the stack of documents before him, with a sensation very close to nausea. He had been working in Department Sachdienst, Scientific and Technical Intelligence, for nearly 8 years now. He had read thousands of intelligence reports during that time, analyzed Western technological developments, briefed senior officers on NATO military capabilities. He considered himself professionally immune to surprise, politically reliable, ideologically sound. But the document he had just finished reading made his hands shake slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. The report was classified streng geheim, top secret, with an additional designation he had never seen before, potentially demoralizing to state security personnel. Distribution strictly limited. Richter had needed special authorization just to access it, approval that came directly from General Oberst Markus Wolf himself, the legendary head of the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, the HVA Foreign Intelligence Directorate. Wolf wanted this report analyzed and contextualized before it went any further up the chain of command. He wanted Richter to find some way to soften its conclusions, to add perspective that might make its findings less devastating to morale. Richter did not know how that would be possible. The report was based on intelligence gathered over 18 months by one of the HVA's most productive agents in West Germany, a man with the cryptonym TOPAS who worked at Siemens and had access to their strategic planning documents. TOPAS had been recruited in 1978, motivated by ideological conviction rather than money, believing genuinely in socialist principles and the eventual triumph of the German Democratic Republic. He had provided excellent intelligence for 6 years, technical specifications, production methods, strategic assessments. His information had helped East German industry reverse engineer several Western products, saving millions in development costs. But TOPAS's latest report was different. It was not a simple technical document describing circuit designs or manufacturing processes. It was a comprehensive strategic assessment of the Western computer industry, compiled from internal Siemens planning documents, industry conferences, trade publications, and personal observations during business trips to the United States. And what it described was a technological and industrial gap so vast that Richter could barely comprehend the implications. The report opened with a visit TOPAS had made to Silicon Valley in September 1983, accompanying Siemens executives on a tour of American semiconductor manufacturing facilities. He had visited Intel's fabrication plant in Santa Clara, where he observed production of the 80286 microprocessor. The 286, as the Americans called it, was a 16-bit processor with 134,000 transistors fabricated on a chip measuring approximately 60 square millimeters. It operated at clock speeds up to 12 megahertz and could address up to 16 megabytes of memory. Intel was producing these chips at a rate of approximately 100,000 units per month, with yields approaching 70%. The selling price was around $150 per chip in volume quantities. TOPAS had carefully noted every detail he could observe or learn from the engineers who guided the tour. The fabrication facility was massive, employing over 2,000 workers operating in shifts around the clock. The clean rooms where chips were manufactured maintained air purity standards that exceeded anything TOPAS had seen in East German facilities by orders of magnitude. The photolithography equipment was Japanese-made, capable of printing circuit features measuring 1.5 micrometers. The testing equipment could process hundreds of chips per hour, automatically sorting functional units from defective ones. The entire process from raw silicon wafer to packaged chip took approximately 6 weeks, and Intel had several such facilities operating simultaneously. The scale was staggering. The quality was exceptional. The pace of innovation was relentless. Intel was already preparing to introduce the 80386, a 32-bit processor with 275,000 transistors that would operate at speeds up to 20 megahertz. This chip would be introduced in 1985, less than a year away. And Intel was not alone. Motorola was producing the 68000 series. Zilog had the Z8000. National Semiconductor, Texas Instruments, AMD, dozens of companies were all producing advanced microprocessors in huge volumes. Richter looked up from the report and rubbed his eyes. He knew what East Germany was producing because he had read those reports too. VB Combinat Microelektronik. The state-owned semiconductor enterprise was struggling to manufacture 8-bit processors comparable to the Intel 8080, a chip that had been introduced in 1974, 10 years behind. And that gap was not closing, it was widening. Every year the Americans advanced further while East German production stumbled over supply problems, equipment failures, yield issues that made consistent high-volume manufacturing nearly impossible. The report continued with TOPAS's observations of American personal computer production. He had visited an IBM facility where they were manufacturing the PCAT, the newest model based on the Intel 80286 processor. The factory was producing 10,000 complete computer systems per week. The assembly line was partially automated, with robotic arms placing components on circuit boards while human workers handled final assembly, testing, and packaging. The quality control was rigorous, with multiple testing stages to ensure that defective systems never reached customers. The entire process from parts inventory to shipping took less than 3 days. IBM was not the only manufacturer TOPAS observed. He had also visited facilities operated by Apple, Hewlett-Packard, and several smaller companies. All of them operated with similar efficiency, similar quality standards, similar output volumes. The American personal computer industry was producing approximately 8 million units annually by 1984, a figure that was projected to grow to 15 million by 1986. The prices were dropping rapidly while capabilities expanded. An IBM PC-AT with 512 kilobytes of memory, a 20-megabyte hard drive, and a high-resolution color monitor could be purchased for approximately $4,000. The same system would cost perhaps $3,000 by 1985 as competition drove prices down and manufacturing efficiency improved. Richter knew the East German figures for comparison. VEB Combinat Robotron, the state-owned computer manufacturer, was producing approximately 30,000 personal computers annually. The flagship model, the PC-1715, used a U880 processor, an unlicensed clone of the Zilog Z80 from 1976. It had 64 kilobytes of memory, no hard drive, and a monochrome monitor. It was compatible with CP/M, an operating system that had been popular in the West in the late 1970s but was rapidly being displaced by MS-DOS and other more advanced systems. The PC-1715 cost approximately 25,000 East German marks, equivalent to nearly 2 years' salary for an average worker. And production was so limited that most units went to government offices, research institutes, and carefully selected industrial applications. Ordinary citizens could not purchase them at any price. The technological gap was bad enough. But TOPAS's report went deeper, analyzing the underlying economic and industrial structures that created these disparities. The American semiconductor industry, he noted, was supported by a massive infrastructure of specialized equipment manufacturers, chemical suppliers, software developers, and research institutions. Companies like Applied Materials produced the fabrication equipment. Suppliers like Monsanto provided ultra-pure chemicals. Universities like Stanford and MIT trained engineers and conducted basic research that fed into commercial applications. The entire system was highly competitive, with companies constantly pressured to innovate or lose market share to rivals. Profit margins drove investment in new technologies, new manufacturing methods, new products. This competitive ecosystem generated a pace of innovation that centrally planned economies simply could not match. Intel introduced a new generation of microprocessors approximately every 2 years. Each generation doubled performance while reducing cost per unit of computing power. This was Moore's law in action, the observation that semiconductor density doubled every 18 to 24 months, a pattern that had held consistent since the 1960s and showed no signs of slowing. The Americans had turned this observation into a self-fulfilling prophecy, investing billions in research and manufacturing to ensure that each new generation met or exceeded the predicted improvements. East Germany's planned economy could not respond to this pace of change. The 5-year planning cycles meant that production targets were set years in advance based on technologies that might be obsolete before the first unit rolled off the assembly line. The lack of competition meant no pressure to innovate quickly, no penalty for delays, no reward for exceeding expectations. The chronic shortages of raw materials and specialized equipment meant that even when engineers developed good designs, manufacturing them reliably at scale was nearly impossible. And the COCOM embargo, the Western export control regime that prohibited sale of advanced technology to communist nations, meant that East Germany could not simply purchase what it needed from Western suppliers. Richter reached the section of the report that had been flagged as most sensitive. TOPAS had included a comparison chart showing computational capability per capita for East Germany versus the United States. He had calculated total processing power available in each country, measured in millions of instructions per second, and divided by population. The numbers were devastating. The United States had approximately 50 times more computational capability per capita than East Germany. 50 times. And that gap was growing wider every year because American production was accelerating, while East German production stagnated. The implications went far beyond personal computers or even industrial applications. Modern military systems depended on advanced microprocessors. Fighter aircraft used them for navigation, weapons targeting, threat assessment. Missiles required them for guidance and control. Naval vessels needed them for radar processing, sonar analysis, fire control. The Americans were integrating computational capability into every weapons system they built, creating forces whose effectiveness multiplied far beyond simple numerical comparisons. An American F-15 fighter with its advanced radar and computer systems could engage multiple targets simultaneously at ranges where a Soviet MiG-23 could not even detect the threat. An Aegis cruiser could track hundreds of contacts and engage dozens of threats simultaneously using computer-controlled phased array radar systems that Eastern Bloc navies could not begin to replicate. This was the heart of why the report had been classified as potentially demoralizing. It was not simply that the West was ahead in the computer technology. Everyone in the intelligence community knew that already. The demoralizing reality was the scope of the gap, the acceleration of Western progress, and the complete inability of the Eastern Bloc to catch up using current methods. The Americans were not just winning the technology race, they were lapping East Germany repeatedly, while the gap grew wider with each passing year. Richter set down the report and walked to the window. His office was on the 4th floor, overlooking the courtyard where Stasi vehicles came and went at all hours. It was early afternoon and Berlin was gray under October clouds, the city divided by walls and checkpoints, and a political system that was falling steadily behind the West in every category that mattered. He had believed, as most loyal citizens of the GDR believed, that socialism would eventually demonstrate its superiority over capitalism. Scientific socialism, they called it. The inevitable triumph of the proletariat. The contradictions of capitalism would cause its collapse while socialist planning would unlock human potential and create a more just and prosperous society. But the report from TOPAS told a different story. The Americans were not collapsing under capitalism's contradictions. They were thriving. Their economy was generating innovation at a pace that made socialist planning look clumsy and slow. Their workers had standards of living that East German citizens could barely imagine, and their technology was advancing so rapidly that the entire Marxist-Leninist critique of capitalism seemed like obsolete theory contradicted by observable reality. The door opened behind him and Oberst Friedrich Müller entered, the senior analyst responsible for Western technology assessment. Mueller was 58 years old, a career intelligence officer who had joined the Stasi in 1950 and worked his way through the ranks on the basis of competence and political reliability. He was not an ideologue or a party fanatic. He was a professional who understood intelligence work and could separate assessment from wishful thinking. "You have read the TOPAS report," Mueller said. It was not a question. "Yes, Herr Oberst, I have read it." "And your assessment?" Richter turned from the window. "It is accurate, sir. I have cross-referenced his observations with other intelligence sources. The Americans are producing microprocessors and computer systems at volumes and sophistication levels that we cannot approach. The gap is large and growing larger." Mueller nodded slowly. "That was my conclusion as well. I have prepared a briefing for General Wolf, and he has asked that you attend. Tomorrow morning, 900 hours. The General wants multiple perspectives on how we should present this information to the Politburo." The Politburo, the highest decision-making body in East Germany, composed of the most senior Communist Party officials, including General Secretary Erich Honecker himself. They would not be pleased to hear that their cherished beliefs about socialist superiority were contradicted by observable facts. They would look for ways to dismiss the intelligence, to question TOPAS's reliability, to find some explanation that preserved their ideological worldview. "Sir, may I speak candidly? In this office, always. Outside this office, never." It was Miller's standard response, and Richter had heard it many times. "We cannot compete with the Americans in computer technology using our current economic system. The planned economy is too slow, too inflexible, too constrained by political considerations to match the pace of innovation in the West. We have known this for years, but this report makes the scope of the problem impossible to ignore. If we present this to the Politburo without context, without recommendations for fundamental economic reform, they will simply classify it and file it away. Nothing will change." Mueller walked to Richter's desk and picked up the TOPAS report. "And if we do recommend fundamental economic reform? If we suggest that the party has been wrong about central planning, that capitalist market mechanisms are superior for technology development? What do you think will happen then?" Richter understood. They would be denounced as defeatists, removed from their positions, possibly arrested. The East German state could not admit that its core ideological assumptions were wrong. Too much depended on maintaining the fiction of socialist superiority. The entire legitimacy of the government rested on the claim that the GDR represented a better, more advanced form of social organization. If that claim was false, if Western capitalism was actually superior, then what justified the wall, the Stasi, the restrictions on freedom, the lower living standards? What justified any of it? Then we are trapped, sir. We cannot tell the truth because the truth is politically unacceptable. And we cannot fix the problem without acknowledging the truth. Exactly. Mueller set the report back on the desk. This is the real meaning of that classification, Hauptmann. Potentially demoralizing. Not just to state security personnel, but to the entire structure of the socialist state. If we acknowledge that the West is superior in technology, in innovation, in economic productivity, then we acknowledge that our entire system is failing, and that acknowledgement would be fatal to the party's legitimacy. They stood in silence for a moment, two intelligence officers who understood that their jobs required them to gather and analyze information honestly, even when that information contradicted everything their government wanted to believe. It was a peculiar form of cognitive dissonance, serving a system that demanded both ruthless honesty and political conformity, requiring officers to see clearly while pretending to be blind. The briefing the next morning took place in General Wolf's personal conference room, a space that was both more comfortable and more secure than the standard meeting rooms. Wolf himself sat at the head of the table, a lean man in his early 60s with iron gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He had run the HVA since 1958, building it into one of the most effective intelligence services in the world. His agents had penetrated NATO, West German government, and numerous Western corporations, He understood both the capabilities and limitations of intelligence work, and he had a reputation for valuing accurate reporting over politically convenient conclusions. Also present were three other senior officers from the HVA's Scientific Intelligence Directorate, plus a representative from the SED Central Committee's Department for Economics, a party functionary named Walter Bauer, who was there to ensure that political considerations were not overlooked. Bauer was precisely the kind of ideological watchdog that made honest intelligence assessment difficult. Wolf opened the meeting without preamble. Gentlemen, we are here to discuss the TOPAS report on Western computer technology. I have read it. It is disturbing. Hauptmann Richter, you have analyzed this report in detail. Give us your assessment. Richter had prepared carefully for this moment. He stood and activated the projector, displaying the first chart from his analysis. General, the TOPAS report documents what we have suspected for some time, but have not quantified so precisely. The technology gap between the GDR and the United States in computer and semiconductor manufacturing is approximately 8 to 10 years and growing wider. We are currently attempting to manufacture chips comparable to American technology from the mid-1970s. The Americans have already moved on to the next 3 generations of technology. He clicked to the next chart, showing production volumes. More significantly, the production capacity gap is even larger than the technology gap. We are producing computers and semiconductors at volumes roughly 50 times smaller than American production. This means that even when we successfully copy Western technology, we cannot deploy it at scale across our economy and military. Bauer interrupted. Hauptmann, surely these figures are exaggerated. We know that American corporations inflate their capabilities for marketing purposes. Have you adjusted for capitalist propaganda? It was exactly the kind of question Richter had expected. Comrade Bauer, these figures come from internal Siemens planning documents, not public marketing materials. Siemens is a West German company that competes directly with American firms. They have no incentive to exaggerate American capabilities. If anything, their internal assessments are likely conservative because they use them for strategic planning and resource allocation. Inflated numbers would lead to bad business decisions. Wolf spoke before Bauer could respond. Continue, Hauptmann. Richter clicked to the next chart, showing the industrial ecosystem. The fundamental problem is not simply that American companies are better at manufacturing semiconductors. The problem is that they operate within an economic system that generates continuous innovation through competition. When Intel introduces a new processor, Motorola and AMD respond with their own advances. When IBM creates a new computer design, dozens of companies copy and improve it. This competitive pressure drives constant improvement in ways that our planned economy cannot replicate. He paused, knowing that his next words would be controversial. The Americans have effectively turned technological development into a self-sustaining process. Each generation of computers is used to design the next generation. Each generation of chips makes possible new software that creates demand for even faster chips. The cycle accelerates continuously. Meanwhile, our system sets 5-year production targets based on technologies that are already obsolete by the time we begin manufacturing them. Miller added his support. The Hauptmann's assessment matches intelligence from multiple sources. We have technical specifications from TOPAS at Siemens, production data from agents in the American electronics industry, economic analysis from our colleagues in the Ministry for Foreign Trade. All sources confirm the same basic picture. The Americans are pulling ahead in computer technology, and we lack the economic mechanisms to close the gap. Bauer shifted uncomfortably. Surely we can purchase or steal the technology we need. Our industrial espionage has been very successful in other fields. Wolf gave him a flat look. We do steal Western technology, Comrade Bauer. We steal it continuously. The HVA has dozens of agents in Western technology companies. We obtain specifications, manufacturing processes, design documents. Do you know what happens? We send this stolen technology to VEB Combinat Microelectronic, and they spend 3 years attempting to implement it. By the time they have a working production line, the Americans have moved on to the next generation. We are trying to steal our way to technological parity, but theft only helps if you can implement what you steal faster than the other side innovates. We cannot. The Americans innovate faster than we can copy. The room went silent. Wolf had just stated what everyone in intelligence knew, but what could rarely be said openly in the presence of party officials. The GDR's industrial espionage was extensive and often successful at obtaining information, but information alone did not bridge the gap when the underlying economic and industrial structures were inadequate. Richter advanced to his final chart showing the military implications. General, the most serious consequence of this technology gap is its impact on military capability. The Americans are integrating advanced microprocessors into every weapon system. Their fighters have computers that process radar data and target information faster than our pilots can react. Their missiles have guidance systems more accurate than anything we can produce. Their ships have integrated combat systems that can engage multiple threats simultaneously. We are attempting to counter these systems with 1970s technology, and the gap widens every year. He took a breath before continuing. There is an additional factor that makes this particularly concerning. The COCOM embargo prevents us from purchasing the specialized manufacturing equipment needed to produce advanced semiconductors. Even if we developed the necessary designs, we lack the fabrication equipment to manufacture them in volume. The Americans have equipment from Applied Materials, Perkin-Elmer, Ultratech. We have equipment that we built ourselves or received from the Soviet Union, and it is generally inferior by at least one generation. Wolf leaned back in his chair. So we cannot buy the equipment. We cannot steal it effectively, and we cannot develop our own in time to keep pace. We are locked into permanent technological inferiority relative to the West. It was a statement, not a question, and no one in the room contradicted it. Bauer finally spoke, his voice tight. General Wolf, are you suggesting that socialism is inherently incapable of matching capitalist technology development? Because that conclusion would be both politically unacceptable and theoretically incorrect according to Marxist-Leninist principles. Wolf gave him a long look. Comrade Bauer, I am suggesting that our current economic system is not generating technological innovation at the pace necessary to match Western capitalist economies. Whether this is an inherent feature of socialism or a correctable flaw in our implementation, I leave to the theoreticians. My job is intelligence assessment, not political theory. But everyone in the room understood what Wolf was really saying. The problem was inherent. Central planning could not match market competition for generating innovation in rapidly evolving technologies. The 5-year plans, the state ownership of production, the lack of profit incentive, the political oversight of technical decisions, all of these features of socialist economic organization created barriers to innovation that capitalist competition avoided. The East German system was structurally unsuited to competing in computer technology, and that unsuitability would only become more pronounced as computers became more central to economic and military capability. The meeting continued for another hour discussing how to present this information to the Politburo without causing a political crisis. They debated language, emphasis, recommendations. Should they acknowledge the full scope of the gap or minimize it to avoid defeatism? Should they recommend major economic reforms or simply ask for more resources for industrial espionage? Should they emphasize the military implications or focus on economic competitiveness? In the end, they decided on a carefully worded compromise. The briefing for the Politburo would acknowledge a significant technology gap in computer and semiconductor manufacturing. It would recommend increased funding for domestic computer development, expanded industrial espionage targeting Western technology companies, and exploration of limited market mechanisms in certain technology sectors. It would not state explicitly that the socialist planned economy was unsuited for rapid technological innovation, but the implication would be clear to anyone paying attention. The briefing was delivered to the Politburo 3 weeks later. Richter was not present, but Müller told him what happened. The Politburo members listened politely asked a few questions, thanked the intelligence officers for their work. Then General Secretary Honecker stood and gave a brief speech about the inevitable triumph of socialism over capitalism, the importance of maintaining ideological purity, and the need to have confidence in East German technical capability. He announced a new initiative called the 1 Megabit Chip Project, an effort to demonstrate that the GDR could match Western semiconductor technology by developing a 1 megabit DRAM chip comparable to what American companies were producing. The project was assigned to VEB Microelectronic Erfurt with a completion date of 1988. It received substantial funding, political support, and regular progress updates to the Politburo. Engineers worked around the clock, struggling with limited equipment, inconsistent materials, and production methods that generated more defective chips than functional ones. The project became a symbol of GDR technical achievement, featured in newspapers and television broadcasts as proof of socialist scientific progress. In the West, Intel, Motorola, Texas Instruments, and Japanese companies like Hitachi and Toshiba were already mass-producing 1 megabit chips by 1985. By 1988, when the East German project finally produced its first working samples of the U-61,000 chip, Western companies had moved on to 4 megabit and 16 megabit chips. The GDR celebrated its achievement with great fanfare, but only 5,000 of the chips were ever manufactured. They were too expensive, too unreliable, and too obsolete to use in any serious application. The entire project had cost hundreds of millions of marks and produced nothing of practical value. Richter watched this unfold with grim resignation. The TOPAS report had been accurate, the intelligence assessment had been honest, the recommendations had been ignored. The party had chosen to believe what it wanted to believe rather than confront uncomfortable realities. And East Germany fell further behind with each passing year. By 1987, the technology gap had grown so wide that even party officials could no longer ignore it. West German visitors brought portable computers that were more powerful than anything East German industry produced. West German television broadcasts showed commercials for home computers that East German citizens could never purchase. The evidence of Western technological superiority was everywhere, visible to anyone with eyes to see. The Stasi compiled more reports, each one documenting the growing disparity. They tracked American semiconductor production capacity now exceeding 5 billion chips annually. They documented the spread of personal computers in Western homes and offices, with more than 30 million units in use by 1987. They noted the development of new technologies like local area networks that connected computers together, creating capabilities that East German systems could not approach. And they observed the integration of computers into every aspect of Western economic activity, from retail sales to banking to industrial automation. Each report carried the same implicit message. The GDR was falling hopelessly behind in the technologies that would define the late 20th century economy, and each report was filed, classified, and effectively ignored by political leadership that could not admit failure without undermining its own legitimacy. Richter received a new assignment in early 1988. He was asked to assess the economic implications of the technology gap for East German long-term viability. It was an unusual request beyond the normal scope of scientific intelligence, and he suspected that someone in the senior leadership was finally asking the hard questions about whether the GDR could survive as an independent state, given its growing technological and economic disadvantages. He spent 3 months on the assessment, working with economists, industrial analysts, and other intelligence officers. The conclusion was stark. The GDR was dependent on subsidized Soviet oil, loans from West Germany, and smuggled Western technology just to maintain its current standard of living. The technology gap meant that East German industrial products were increasingly uncompetitive in world markets. The country was running a growing trade deficit, accumulating debt that could not be repaid, and maintaining living standards only through unsustainable borrowing. Without fundamental economic reform or massive external subsidy, the system would collapse within a decade. Richter submitted the report in June 1988. It was classified at the highest level and distributed to only 5 people. He never learned what response it generated, if any. But less than 18 months later, the Berlin Wall fell, East Germany's government collapsed, and the two Germanys began reunification. The system that had promised to build a socialist paradise superior to Western capitalism simply ceased to exist, unable to sustain itself in competition with an economy that generated innovation faster than central planning could copy. In later years, after the Stasi archives were opened and researchers began examining the intelligence reports from the 1980s, Richter's assessments were rediscovered. Historians noted how accurately the reports had documented the technology gap and how clearly they had foreseen the economic consequences. Several academic papers were written, analyzing why the East German leadership had ignored such clear warnings. The consensus was that the leadership had trapped itself in an ideological framework that made acknowledging capitalist superiority politically impossible. They could not admit that market economics worked better than central planning without undermining the entire justification for the East German state. So, they chose to ignore the evidence until reality forced itself upon them in the form of economic collapse. The TOPAS report, the document that had been classified as potentially demoralizing in 1984, was eventually published in full in a collection of declassified Stasi documents. Readers could see for themselves how comprehensive and accurate the intelligence had been. TOPAS had documented not just the immediate technology gap, but the structural economic factors that made the gap unbridgeable within the existing system. He had essentially predicted the eventual collapse of the GDR 5 years before it happened, though he probably did not realize it at the time. TOPAS himself was never publicly identified. The Stasi protected the identities of agents who had acted from ideological conviction rather than mercenary motives. But researchers noted that someone at Siemens with access to strategic planning documents and extensive U.S. contacts had provided intelligence to East Germany throughout the 1980s. That person had observed American technological superiority up close, documented it meticulously, and reported honestly even though the truth contradicted his ideological beliefs. Whether he eventually questioned those beliefs, whether he understood that his reports were being ignored, whether he felt betrayed when the system he believed in collapsed, these questions remained unanswered. Klaus Richter left the intelligence service in 1990, shortly after reunification. He was debriefed by West German authorities, who were interested in what the Stasi had known about Western technology and when they had known it. He showed them the reports from TOPAS and others, the assessments he had written, the briefings that had been delivered and ignored. The West German intelligence officers were impressed by the quality of the intelligence gathering, but puzzled by the lack of response. "You knew all this," one of them said, flipping through Richter's 1988 economic assessment. "You knew the system was failing, that the technology gap was fatal, that the GDR could not survive without fundamental reform. Why didn't your government do something?" Richter gave him a tired smile. They could not. Doing something would require admitting that socialism had failed, that capitalism worked better, that the entire structure of the state was built on false premises. The party could not make that admission without destroying itself. So they chose to believe comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths. They chose to pretend everything was fine until the moment the whole system collapsed. But you knew, the intelligence service knew, you were telling them. We told them what they did not want to hear, so they stopped listening. It was, Richter thought, a perfect summary of why the East German state had failed. Not because they lacked intelligence about Western capabilities, not because they could not assess technological trends, not because their analysis was wrong. They failed because the political system could not respond to accurate intelligence when that intelligence contradicted core ideological beliefs. They failed because truth was subordinated to political necessity, and political necessity required maintaining fictions that reality would eventually destroy. The computer technology gap was just one aspect of this larger failure, but it was perhaps the most visible and measurable. When Richter had started analyzing Western technology in the late 1970s, the gap had been significant but not catastrophic. East German computers were inferior to Western models, but they functioned and served their purpose. By the late 1980s, the gap had grown so wide that comparison became almost meaningless. Western personal computers had more computational power than East German mainframes. Western children played with technology in their homes that exceeded what East German industry could manufacture. The disparity was not merely quantitative, it was qualitative, representing a fundamental difference in the capacity to innovate and produce. And that disparity existed because of the economic systems that generated the technology. The West's competitive market economy created incentives for constant innovation, punished stagnation, rewarded success, and generated investment capital for new ventures. The East's planned economy did none of these things effectively. It allocated resources by political decision rather than market demand, measured success by meeting predetermined targets rather than satisfying customers, protected established industries rather than enabling new ones, and subordinated technical decisions to political considerations. The TOPAS report had documented all of this clearly. It had shown not just that the West was ahead, but why the West was ahead, and why that advantage would be sustained. And it had been classified as potentially demoralizing because acknowledging these facts would undermine belief in the system, damage morale, and raise questions that the party could not answer without admitting fundamental failure. In the end, the report was indeed demoralizing, but not in the way the classification suggested. It was demoralizing not because it revealed enemy strength, but because it revealed systemic weakness that could not be corrected within the existing political framework. It was demoralizing because it showed intelligent, dedicated people that they were serving a system that was doomed to fail and that their honest, professional work documenting that failure would be ignored by political leadership committed to comfortable delusions. Richter sometimes wondered what might have happened if the Politburo had responded differently to the intelligence they received. What if Honecker had admitted in 1984 that the planned economy was failing to generate technological innovation? What if the party had implemented market reforms in the mid-1980s, allowed private companies to operate in technology sectors, permitted foreign investment, and acknowledged that capitalist methods worked better for certain industries? Would the GDR have survived? Would it have remained socialist in any meaningful sense? Or would any serious reform have triggered the same collapse that eventually occurred, just at a different time and under different circumstances? These were hypothetical questions that could never be answered. What was certain was that the path actually taken, ignoring honest intelligence in favor of ideological comfort, had led directly to disaster. The technology gap documented in the TOPAS report was both symptom and cause of the larger systemic failure that destroyed East Germany. It was a symptom because it reflected the planned economy's inability to compete with market capitalism in rapidly evolving industries. And it was a cause because the technology gap made East German industry uncompetitive, which generated economic problems that required increasing debt and subsidy, which eventually became unsustainable, which led to political crisis and collapse. The classification, potentially demoralizing, was ultimately an admission that the truth itself was dangerous to the state. A political system that fears honest intelligence, that classifies accurate reports as threats to morale, that subordinates reality to ideology cannot survive indefinitely. Eventually, reality imposes itself regardless of what anyone believes. The computer technology gap was real. The economic consequences were real. The structural inability of central planning to match market innovation was real. And no amount of classification or denial could change these facts. Klaus Richter understood this by 1984, though he could not say it openly. The TOPAS report had made the reality impossible to ignore for anyone willing to see. East Germany was trapped in a system that could not acknowledge failure without self-destruction, that could not reform without ceasing to be socialist, that could not compete but could not admit it could not compete. The technology gap in computers was simply the most measurable evidence of a deeper problem that pervaded the entire economy and political structure. And so the reports were written, classified as demoralizing, filed away, and ignored. The party maintained its rhetoric about socialist superiority. The citizens noticed the growing gap between propaganda and observable reality. The economy struggled under burdens it could not sustain. And eventually, the entire system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, exactly as the honest intelligence assessments had predicted it would. The TOPAS report, potentially demoralizing to state security personnel, turned out to be simply accurate. The truth it documented was indeed demoralizing, but not because it revealed anything false or exaggerated. It was demoralizing because it revealed a truth that the East German state could neither acknowledge nor survive. And in the end, survival required acknowledging truth, which meant the state itself could not survive. That was the real lesson of the classified intelligence reports on Western computer technology. Not that the West was ahead, though it was. Not that the gap was large, though it was. The lesson was that a political system based on denying uncomfortable realities will eventually be destroyed by those realities, no matter how many reports are classified, how many facts are suppressed, or how many officials refuse to acknowledge what their own intelligence services tell them. Truth does not require belief to be true, and systems built on denying truth do not require acknowledgement to fail. They simply fail, inevitably, when reality can no longer be postponed.